Okay. On Communion Sunday, we kind of move through all the talking part and then sing our way to the table. So I will remind you, Mark's Gospel, 16 chapters, the shortest one. He's very spare, he's very direct, he's very to the point. And we were laughing at lectionary study this week that kind of with Mark, you race through the chapters because there's so much packed in there. I invite you, as we come to Lent later this month, why don't you take on reading the entire Gospel of Mark as one of your Lenten disciplines? That's what we're going to be studying this year, so that would not be a bad thing. Because here we are, just at the 29th verse of the first chapter, right? And Jesus has been in the wilderness, he's been in the river, he's been at the synagogue, and now he's at the home of Simon Peter. And then he gets up early and goes out to a quiet place to pray. Oops, and then he moves on right again. From the synagogue to Peter's home, where Peter's mother-in-law is unable to be up and about her work. Did you notice? They told Jesus about that right away. Can't you imagine that he arrived at the door and they said, Peter's mother-in-law is sick in the back. Will you do something about that, Jesus? Here's the deal with this tiny little story. This woman's calling had been taken from her by her falling ill. It's really important always to understand the culture of the stories that we read, and in that culture, illness bore a very heavy social cost. Because not only would a person be unable to earn a living and thereby contribute to the well-being of the household, but the role that a person played in the community was critical. It was how you had value. And so by being sick, Peter's mother-in-law now had no value. She was cut off. What was her task? To offer hospitality. She was cut off from doing that, which integrated her into her place and her role. Who was she when she was no longer able to fulfill her calling? And that's the first point I want us to think about today, because we each have a calling. We each have gifts and talents and energy, and part of being part of a community, the community called church, is that together we have enough. Each one of our gifts thrown into this central gathering place is enough to change the world. This larger calling that we have to contribute to the shared life of the community, that really is part of the definition of what it means to be a Christian. We cannot be a Christian alone. We are required to be with others in order to live into that calling. So this little bit of the gospel today asks us to examine what might be cutting us off. What is the fever that we have, as Peter's mother-in-law had? What might be cutting us off from full participation in our calling? The question of identity, who are we apart from our place in this family? That's an important question. And it should cause us to ask for what we need from Jesus in order to get back into the fullness of our being. Jesus came, took her by the hand, and lifted her up. In the Greek, the phrase would be better, raised her up. In chapter 16, here we are in chapter 1. In chapter 16, there are angels at the tomb who say this, do not be afraid. You're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He has been raised up. Here at the beginning, Mark uses the same word for Jesus' healing of Peter's mother-in-law that is used about Jesus himself at the end. So what that suggests, of course, is that new strength is imparted to those laid low by illness, unclean spirits, demons, or even death. so that they might rise again and take their place in the world. Lifted up, given back to life in a new way, a fuller way, a restored way. It's important for us to see from Mark that healing is about restoring to community and living into your calling. It's a role as well as a restoration to life. The gospel is telling us that life without community and each of our participation in that community is a bleak life indeed. I can't tell you how important this is. You may think that you come here on Sunday morning voluntarily, that you make a choice to get up and get dressed and be here before that bell rings 10 times. And of course, at one level, you do. But there is this other level, and this other level wants to be heard in your spirit, because that level is the voice of God who has called each of us by name, who has claimed each of us for this calling to be the representatives of Christ on earth. When you're absent, there's a hole in the fabric of our community. When you get angry at someone here in the community, there's another tiny rip in the fabric, especially if the person that you're angry with doesn't even know that you're angry with them. If we walk out of here in a huff on a Sunday morning, that's another rip in the fabric. And if there's not a chance for us to honestly have conversations with one another, a chance to practice forgiveness, a chance to be engaged in reconciliation, well, as you can imagine, after enough tears in the fabric cannot be repaired and community falls apart. But we have to all be in on this, you see, all the time. So let me say it again. We are not here by chance or by choice. I believe God has called us to be this particular configuration of people, and we have a responsibility to one another that comes from God. And what is that responsibility? It's the same sermon I preach week in and week out. It's to practice forgiveness, to practice reconciliation, to practice loving one another. Where else in the world? Where else in the world, except in the church, is that our task? So right after Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, she gets up and begins to serve them. Ooh, another cool thing, if only we all knew Greek. The word for serve is diakonio. And so this morning the deacons will serve communion. Of course, that's where diaconate comes from. And it's the same verb that Jesus uses later in Mark when he says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." This unnamed woman is the first character in the Gospel of Mark who exemplifies true discipleship. She gets up and she serves. Well, it's great, because after this little healing story about Simon's mother-in-law, the whole city lines up. Can't you see it? Outside the door of Simon's house, they all want a piece of this action, and Jesus cures the sick, casts out many demons. You know, I think we here in the United States are beset by many, many demons, if you will. Addictions, fear, anxiety, a sense of scarcity, envy, greed, desire to be in control. For followers of Jesus who have been paying attention, we have to know that these demonic forces are the opposite of what God wants for us. They're born of our humanness, if you will. They're petty. They're beneath us. They live in our hearts and minds, and they nag away at us when we begin to break free of them and say no more. Surely you're not going to write a check that big to the church when we have other bills to pay. Make sure we lock that communion stuff away, because you never know when a druggie might break in here and steal that stuff upon it. We can't put a line item in the budget for mission. There's not enough money. And after all, we get 10% of the game supper proceeds. And my favorite, and I say this somewhat sarcastically, so please forgive me, unless Holy Communion is served the way we've always received it, well, it's just not communion. Jesus in this story won't let the demons speak, because like everything, when we're new to something, when we're new to, say, fearless living, or trusting rather than being worried, to celebrating abundance rather than holding on, to commitment, to contentment with who we are and what we have and not always looking around to see who has more and better, to giving up that impossible attempt to try to control things. When we're new to something, it takes practice before it becomes just a matter of course. And we need one another to remind us and practice with us. Shut up, demons, until we're stronger. And then those old niggling demons won't have a chance, because we will be living strongly into our calling. In the story today, after a frightfully busy day, Jesus goes off to pray, which of course is a reminder to us to have balance in our lives. And the disciples hunt him down, Scripture says, with news that there's more people, more needs, more cares. Come on, Jesus. Everybody's searching for you. And Jesus says, oh, time to go. Time to go on to the next town, because that's why I've come. We have to go on and spread the news. And that's where our calling comes in. Maybe this story is really more about us today than it even was about Jesus back then. Because there's lots of people who maybe couldn't even name Jesus as what it is that they're hunting for, searching for. Our calling, perhaps, is to go and take the hand and raise the person up and help them to enter into this amazing life that's lived with Jesus. Real quick, that passage from Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, I have become all things to all people so that I might share the blessings of the gospel with as many as possible. This is one of those crazy counterintuitive passages like, geez, Paul, aren't you supposed to be authentically who you are in order to share yourself with others? Except what Paul says is that he does all things for the sake of getting that good news of Jesus out to as many people as possible. He is like on fire with the gospel. Kind of, I'll go anywhere, at any time, to anybody, in order to testify to this great news. Rich, poor, Jewish, pagan, synagogue, local tavern, soccer game, town meeting. The list goes on and on. We are called to be on fire with the gospel. Have you not known, have you not heard? Isaiah thunders to his people in exile who are worried and alone and frightened. Peterson says, why would you ever complain or whine saying, God has lost track of me, or God doesn't care what happens to me? Don't you know anything? Haven't you been listening? God doesn't come and go. God stays. So let us prepare to come to the table to meet our lasting God, our calling God, our claiming God, our liberating God, our empowering God, our loving God, the one we know so clearly from what we read in Jesus. And as we come, let us allow God to take our hand, cast out whatever blocks us from living into our call, and lift us up to send us on our way. All that in 10 little verses from Mark's Gospel. So on Communion Sunday, we are invited to lift up the concerns as we always do, and then as we gather at the table, that's where we bring those concerns to God in prayer. So what is on your heart and in your minds today? Miss Mary over here. I want to just say thank you for giving me last Sunday off. We had a great time. The deacons had given Gary and I a margaritas gift card, and so Saturday we saw a movie and we went to dinner and